Today we are going to go over period 7, which is from 1890 to 1945. Period 7 is one of those time periods in APUSH that is just massive, okay? We fight 2 world wars, we expand into the Caribbean, we also go through our own economic depression and rebuilding. But keep in mind that this time period, the turn of the century, the America that we know in the 1900s is vastly different from the America our founding fathers had established. We have different government and different ways that things are done, and we have different politics at the state level that will eventually merge. We also have societal organizations that will help address some of these societal differences that we have emerging, and we'll finally recognize that, hey, things are going wrong. We then, of course, end the 1920s with a depression, and then we go into the 30s and 1940s with rebuilding our economy and entering into World War II. So to start with, I want to kind of look at the early new foreign policy. And I say early because I don't mean World War I, World War II. I'll separate those out, okay? So looking at foreign policy and foreign policy changes that go on and where we become involved, okay? So, at that line there. Looking at the new foreign policy for this era. Starting off, we are going to look at 2 big ideas, okay? Imperialism and jingoism. So imperialism is going out and conquering other nations, which the United States started to do not only in the Caribbean, but into Central America and into the Pacific Ocean. But then we will also be, kind of doing it because we notice what Europe is doing, going into Africa, going into Asia, and even part of Latin America, and trying to expand for raw materials, expand for power, prestige, markets to sell to, all of that. Now, with the idea of jingoism, as far as another idea, is that we are going to see this extreme patriotism, and it's going to take an aggressive turn. And we see that in a couple different locations, like in Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, Panama. So starting to take a look at some of these areas, let's start with Hawaii. So keep in mind, Hawaii had, I have too many I's, but you guys understand the idea of spelling Hawaii, right? So for Hawaii, we had taken over the territory starting in the late 1880s. We had Christian missionaries there, as well as economic interests, okay? So companies had established themselves there, like the Dole Corporation. And we eventually took over the island of Hawaii from Queen Liliuokalani and established ourselves there as trying to better the people's lives, okay? Then we have the Cubans, okay, and what's going on in Cuba. So in Cuba, you have President William McKinley, who wanted to kind of stay away from their foreign affairs because Cuba had been controlled by Spain. However, Americans felt like the tug on their heart, if you will, as well as on their purse strings, that maybe we should help liberate Cuba from the Spanish crown. And that is partially because of Weyler, okay? And he's nicknamed Weyler the Butcher. And he had been exerting control and force over the Cubans to keep them in line against the Spanish crown. So it did turn into a genocide. And so then the United States started to pursue, okay, what are our actions? And we had sent the USS Maine down to Cuba. And as it was docked in Cuba, it ended up, in the harbor of Cuba, it ended up exploding. And this was in February of 1898. Now, the USS Maine explosion, we blamed it on Spain immediately, and we have the snazzy headline, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. So between the Maine explosion and you have the sensational news stories, the yellow journalism coming out from Cuba, care of Pulitzer and Hearst, we end up going to war, okay? Now, in reality, it wasn't Spain that attacked our ship and, set a bomb off underneath it or a mine. It was actually that the coal room and like the gunpowder room were too close together, and there was some sort of combustion that ended up killing 266 people aboard the ship. So going to war, we ended up going into war in April of 1898, and by 1899 the war was over. Okay, it was a relatively short war. The U.S. was not super prepared for war in Cuba. We, sent Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders over there, but guess what? They didn't have horses. We sent our men in wool uniforms that were not built, for the Caribbean, that type of thing. But so we begin to expand our scope of foreign policy and that aggressive nature as we see it, particularly in Cuba. Now, when the war in Cuba does end, with Cuba being liberated from Spain, the U.S. is involved, and we end up purchasing like Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Samoa, a bunch of different islands, kind of to start creating this sphere of protection around us for not only in the Caribbean, but then also in the Pacific Ocean. So also as part of Cuba, just remember that you have, as I already mentioned, but the Roosevelt Rough Riders, named after Teddy Roosevelt. And then you also have the Buffalo Soldiers. And the Buffalo Soldiers in particular were at San Juan Hill, and they helped aid the Roosevelt Rough Riders and protect them from getting destroyed. Now, the Buffalo Soldiers were African Americans who were fighting in this war. And at first they got the praise, but then it kind of later got taken away from them by some of the actions and words from Teddy Roosevelt. So after Cuba, because in theory we had bought the Philippines, we start looking at the Philippines. And, it comes up from the question, did we buy them or go to war? And we ended up going to war in the Philippines, and this is where you may recall the name Emilio Aguinaldo. And we had actually helped bring him back into the Philippines because he had been exiled previously by Spain. And we needed his support in taking over the island, but then he ended up turning on us. And the U.S., between our military and our Navy, was really no strength for the Filipinos, and we ended up taking them over. Now, part of the things with the Philippines, kind of like Cuba and Hawaii, you're looking at religion, you're looking at converting them culturally, and basically trying to convert the people into becoming more Americanized and civilized. Now, pictures, cartoons that were then printed in American magazines and newspapers, keep in mind, did not portray like the Hawaiians, the Cubans, the Filipinos as advanced people. They looked like monkeys, they looked ignorant, they looked like they were simpletons or little children that needed big old Uncle Sam to help take care of them, okay? So then after Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, we also have our involvement in the Panama Canal. Now for the Panama Canal, Panama originally did not exist as a nation. It was tucked in there between modern-day Nicaragua and Colombia. And France had originally started to build the canal there, but due to economic reasons and political reasons, they ended up stalling. And so in 1903, the United States gets involved in Panama, and we help basically liberate them as a nation. We create Panama. And we then start building our canal. And this is going to be done by like mid-1911, 1914, that type of idea. Now, just a quick little note, remember that this is from Colombia and that it divides a continent in half. Okay? Because building the Panama Canal basically allowed the United States to use it for economic purposes to bring ships through, as well as then potentially military purposes. Because the time that it took going from the east coast of America all the way around the southern tip of South America and then up again to the west coast was ridiculous. Or you could stop midway through, take trains across the continent, at, Central America and then board another ship and on up. But even that took time and was sometimes unreliable and unsafe. And so now building the canal, even though it divided a continent in half, it was to the U.S. economic advantage and military advantage. So other things of note during this foreign policy is going to be the different way 3 specific presidents handled different matters at the time, okay? So starting off with Teddy Roosevelt. Now, I had already mentioned he led troops in Cuba for the Spanish-American War in 1898 with that. But as president, Teddy Roosevelt had what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine from the 1820s. And it basically said that the U.S. would act as international police power in Latin America and in Central America to help end any sort of European unjust power and their exertion there. Now, this became known for the U.S. as our big stick policy. Speak softly, but carry a big stick, meaning try to talk it out, but make sure you can back it up with action if you need to. In chronological order, next you have President Taft. And Taft used what is called dollar diplomacy. And the idea behind dollar diplomacy is that we would use our economic power to exert leverage over other nations and control them, to help bring in money there, but also establish American corporations to our favor, that type of idea. But the idea was, let's use our economic, fortunes in order to influence regions. And then you have Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was more of an idealist, if you will, and he had what was called moral diplomacy. And he was a religious man, but he did believe that, we should be making the world safe for democracy. We should be taking over people to help civilize them, improve their lot in life, that type of thing. Now, keep in mind the dollar diplomacy the moral diplomacy under Wilson. We use it in Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, that type of idea. The ironic part with Wilson, don't forget, is that he actually increased American foreign influence than the other 2 previous presidents, with the exception, of course, of World War I, So that kind of takes us through some of the early foreign policy changes that occur as we expand and imperialize. So let's take a look then at some of the domestic changes that occur. So in this time period, it's like how much more can happen besides foreign policies? Let's talk about all of the domestic stuff going on, right? Domestically, America completely flips around. We will still have racial prejudice in our nation. After the Civil War, we will still be prejudiced against immigrants that are coming in, but we also start to look at the societal differences of the haves versus have-nots and try to, not equalize things, but make things better for people. So starting off with some of these domestic changes, let's start off with what's known as the Progressive Era. Now, this progressive era, because we're going to progress, we're going to make these changes in America, is going to be led by a group of people known as the muckrakers. Now, the muckrakers were, digging through the dirt, that type of thing, to expose the truth behind what's going on in America. And 2 of the famous muckrakers, just to name some, are going to be Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair. Now, Ida Tarbell exposed the Standard Oil Company in an expose article and basically pinpointed them as an evil monopoly that took over control from, smaller businesses. And ironically enough, one of those businesses had been owned by her family. But Ida Tarbell exposed, Rockefeller and his company as being ruthless and maybe not allowing for enough competition to benefit society. Upton Sinclair, as it is said, he aimed for people's hearts through the story of an immigrant family, but really hit us in our stomach with his story of the jungle. And the jungle ended up exposing the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And because of him, you then have changes that eventually evolved into like the food inspection, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and what now we know as the Food and Drug Administration. But it's these muckrakers that we begin to really see some of these changes. Now, we also have, during this progressive era, we have the Clayton Antitrust Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act purposely targeted the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act that got the ball rolling against corporations and monopolies. So the Sherman Antitrust Act had set in place, like, let's start regulating monopolies, let's start breaking them apart, but there's really no enforcement behind it, okay? There are a lot of loopholes that the Clayton Antitrust Act then tried to close, okay? And it is said that Teddy Roosevelt was a trust buster, breaking up a lot of trusts, monopolies, that type of thing, these big corporations. But the reality is Taft was a bigger trust buster than Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and Taft started to get miffed at each other because Taft broke up some trusts that Roosevelt had deemed were actually okay previously. But this Clayton Antitrust Act also helped out placing limitations on corporate leadership, merger notifications, that type of idea. And then during this progressive era and some of these other changes that we also have like settlement houses. And these settlement houses are going to be like the Hull House. And this is Jane Addams. Okay? And settlement houses were in cities for immigrants, starting in Chicago at first, but to help the betterment of the immigrants, help them learn how to read, write, speak English, but then also perhaps finding jobs and even like temporary daycare, that type of idea. You also have Margaret Sanger, and you have more education reform, now making it compulsory. Now making it compulsory for children to go to school. And this is going to be, again, Margaret Sanger. So then you have also, as part of this progressive era and some of these changes going on, you then have, and this will come up again later, but like the 19th Amendment, which is in 1920, women's right to vote. So that is just like a snapshot of the progressive era and some of these changes that come about. What I would really recommend you also remembering is that these domestic changes helped further people along because of the horrible conditions, but also look at things that happen in cities, the changes to your Jacob Riis. I should mention him. He's actually a muckraker. And this is like the tenement living and how awful like the other half lives, okay? Then you also have, during these domestic changes, some things going on for the immigrants, okay? So for the immigrants, you have this new wave of immigrants coming from the south and eastern part of Europe and from Asia, and they were not welcomed with open arms. This is where you will then see extreme xenophobia. And xenophobia, again, is your prejudice against a specific group of people. And because of this xenophobic movement, okay, with the immigrants at this time, we will see different quotas and different acts put in place, all of them building on limitations of the previous ones, okay? The one in 1924, the Immigration Quota Act of 1924, specifically used the 1890 census data to then place restrictions on South and Eastern European immigrants. So like what that basically means is we were using the 1890 numbers of who was coming into America to then place limitations on who could come in 1924. Well, common sense would say in the 1890s, we don't have that many immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe at all compared to 1924. And so we were really limiting that number of people. Now, Northern and Western Europe, come on in, not a problem. The other quotas and acts that were placed at this time period, don't forget the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay? And that in particular was after building the Transcontinental Railroad, trying to protect American jobs in California and across the nation, but basically excluding people that were so vastly different from us, or deemed to be so. Last part of domestic changes is that we are going to look at the blacks in America, the African Americans. So you have what's known as the Great Migration, and this is going to be the movement into the northern industrial cities. You have Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, New York that emerge, okay? You also have organizations for the African Americans that will emerge, such as the NAACP, and then you have like Marcus Garvey with his Back to Africa movement. But also part of this time period is going to be race riots in cities. In 1919, there was a race riot in Chicago that was tipped off at a beach. Then in 1921, there's one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just to like be aware of these. Now, also during these domestic changes, the Progressive Era, don't forget that you also have tragedies that had to bring about change. Kind of like how Sinclair exposed the tragedy of the meatpacking industry, you also have the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York, where women were trapped inside. Hundreds ended up dying because they couldn't escape. The fire escapes weren't, available. The elevators weren't moving. And of course, we realize fire department couldn't reach the upper 8th and 9th floors, okay? So remember some of the tragedies that bore the reasons for these changes that we had, okay? So then I wanted to talk about some things that bring us into the turn of the century, but in particular looking at World War I. Okay, so for World War I, now World War I began in Europe far earlier than America was actually involved in, okay? So World War I blew up in Europe because of a couple different reasons. This is like your acronym MAIN. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and then you have your SPARC, which was your Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated. So again, let's go back to the idea of MAIN. Militarism. The building up of your military, not trusting necessarily what your foreign, next door country neighbor is doing, okay? They're building up their navy. If they're building up their army, the question is why? And keep in mind, they're ready to go at a moment's notice then because they're prepared, not reactionary. Alliances is forming buddies with each other. The alliances that came out from World War I are going to be the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, or what we would then call the Central and Allied Powers. So the Central Powers are going to be Italy for a little bit of time, and then they switch to the American side. But you have, in particular, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And then you have, on the other side, Great Britain, France, Russia, and then America as well, as when we eventually get involved. Imperialism had talked about previously, but keeping in mind conquering other areas, looking at territory access, that type of thing. And then N for nationalism, your intense pride for your nation, right? So World War I, things are heating up in Europe, and that final spark that ignites the war is going to be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And he was next in line for the Austrian throne. So because of that, you then have this war that then, domino effect brings in everyone involved into the war, and Europe explodes. Okay. Now, you have during this time period President Woodrow Wilson, who is in charge of America, and he manages to keep us out of the war, but we really begin to question, what's the role of America going to be in a global conflict? Do we go back to the ideals of George Washington, where he said, don't involve yourself in foreign affairs? Do we stay neutral, therefore? Do we get involved in the war? And on which side? Because culturally, we had ties to both the Allied and the Central Powers. So what ends up happening, though, is for America to enter the war, there's a series of events that happen. So in 1915, we have the Lusitania that is sunk, okay? And about 128 Americans were aboard the Lusitania. Now, there is question as to whether the Lusitania was strictly a travel passenger ship or were they also moving weapons. Then you have, in 1917, the Zimmerman telegram or the Zimmerman note between Germany and Mexico. And the British had intercepted it, translated it, sent it on to America. And the gist of this note was Germany saying, hey, Mexico, we will help fund it, but if you promise to distract America on, in the North American continental region, while we take over Europe, we will help you then ultimately get more land back that the Americans had taken from you, looking at the Southwest, Texas, that type of idea. And then kind of the third final note was the submarine warfare. So the submarine warfare had been going on. Germany had been particularly strong in this, even against the British Navy that was supposed to be superior. But the German submarine warfare had taken out ships like the Lusitania, the Sussex, the Arabic. And it had even resulted in something called the Sussex Pledge, where Germany promised, hey, we promise not to sink any ships without giving proper notice to get the crew and people off the boats, right? But that was ultimately broken as well. So when you combine all of these things together, Woodrow Wilson eventually asks Congress to declare war. And during the war, America did not enter until 1917. And when we fought in 1917, we provided for the Allied powers much needed relief. We had all along been supplying weapons, food from our farms, that type of thing, but now they really needed the manpower relief. And so we ended up providing that and helped turn the tide of the war against the Germans and for the Allied powers to ultimately defeat them. Now, initially entering into the war, Russia, Great Britain, France, America had all agreed we would start the war together, end this war together, that type of thing. But Russia had gone through in 1917, 1918 what was called the Bolshevik Revolution, where they overthrew the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, and who was a Romanov, and ended up the Russian Revolution brought about communism then, okay? And so Russia was out of the war. America's brought in, but we brought that fresh wave of boys to help fight the war, to help secure it. Now, keep in mind, in the war, you still do have discrimination and segregation within our armed services. But the French in particular valued our African American soldiers that had served and ended up giving them several different war medals of honor for African Americans that fought during World War I. So how does World War I end up, talking about some of the, the peace agreements and stuff like that? So for peace, you end up with the Treaty of Versailles and then Wilson's 14 points. So Wilson's 14 points were always his ideology that, after this war, we would help set up democracy for all nations, that they would be able to hold their own elections, freedom of the seas, that type of idea. Not bad ideas. They were absorbed into the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, though, had this key point called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was basically an agreement that countries would unite together in the face of war, creating an alliance system. And America refused to get involved in that. World War I was a very deadly war and horrible even for soldiers that survived. As far as post-traumatic stress disorder, seeing all the horrors that they saw in the trench warfare, experiencing like the mustard gas and things like that. And so America was very hesitant to enter into the Treaty of Versailles because of the League of Nations. And as a result, the U.S. did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. We signed our own separate peace treaty. And it basically encompassed everything minus that League of Nations aspect of it, okay? Now, the League of Nations was kind of Wilson's baby, but as he was going on the campaign trail to try to drum up support to sign it, he ended up falling into ill health and couldn't ever convince people to, support the legislation to sign the Treaty of Versailles that had to be signed by the Senate. So, other problems that emerged during World War I, or other things of note, problems I use because it's civil liberties. So the deal with civil liberties are going to be your restrictions on Americans. Americans did tremendous work at home during this time period. Okay, women entering the workforce, African Americans entering the workforce, farmers supplying not only for our troops, but people, civilians and troops abroad as well, right? But civil liberties were definitely curtailed during this time period. You had the Espionage Act and Sedition Acts. So these acts in 1917, 1920 were specifically to make it illegal for you to interfere with any efforts during the wartime, and if you were spreading anti-American propaganda. The Sedition Act said that you could not have like abusive anti-American language, okay? And a lot of that was because of the Bolshevik Revolution that had happened in Russia and this fear of communism that began to spread. Other problems with our civil liberties would be going back to that idea of xenophobia. And xenophobia, keep in mind, is your direct attention against a specific group of people, okay? Your prejudice against them. And we're looking at immigrants, okay? Now, other civil liberties that were curtailed during this time period, people getting involved in the draft. You have Supreme Court cases that had to emerge because of it that you then can establish for clear and present danger, those types of ideas with World War I, okay? So, after World War I, we end up going into, because it's the turn of the century, right? We start to see more and more development in our nation with communication, transportation, technology, and the spreading of more like modern values and ideas and massive cultural changes, okay? So in the 1920s, and this is like the positive part of the 1920s, I guess, compared to like the economic crash at the end of the 20s. You're going to have, for the 1920s, this idea of consumerism and consumption. We were riding high after coming out on top of World War I as far as a global power. And our boys came back home, they entered back into the workforce, and with new improvements, we started just cranking out all sorts of products from, your automobiles with Henry Ford to radios to refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, those types of consumer projects, right? Or products, I should say. And people wanted to buy them. So we have this idea of massive consumerism and consumption as well. Then we also have this idea of traditionalists versus modernists. And the ideas of the traditionalists would be like the old ways. And then modernists would be viewed as the new ways, the new influences, the new morals, that type of thing. So the traditionalists wanted to more so keep things remaining the same. They were also the ones that pushed for the temperance movement, which is anti-alcohol. And so eventually the 18th Amendment for Prohibition was passed. The modernists, on the other hand, this is where you start to see the cultural conflicts, okay? Like the flapper girls, women that are working in the industries, in offices, that they're not, staying at home on the farm. They're becoming more modern, independent women. This is your jazz era. This is your speakeasy era, because of prohibition and stuff like that. This is also your time period of, your gang violence. You have your Al Capones of the era. But you also have going on during this time period the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance, is going to be your African American cultural literature and art movement, okay? Namely in Harlem, New York. And within this movement, you have people like Duke Ellington, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, who bring about changes. And it's finally like this recognition of African Americans who have talent and help shape the American culture, especially in cities like in New York. But so this is part of the 1920s to acknowledge, because I had mentioned previously, as part of domestic changes like the race riots, those aren't going away. And the race riots definitely happened during the 1920s, but you also see some of these positive changes and advancements for African Americans, especially culturally, okay? As part of the 1920s, you also have some crimes that occur, not just with Capone, but you have Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants who are accused and then executed because they supposedly stole from the payroll master, okay, as he was going to make his deposit. You have lynching still going on predominantly in the South. You have the emergence of re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan during this era as well. You have Leopold and Loeb, who committed the crime of the century when they kidnapped Bobby Frank, one of their cousins, and tried to commit this perfect murder. Why? Because these boys were off the charts smart and used it as a mental exercise. Then you also have Charles Lindbergh, who not only made the transatlantic flight by himself, right, going from America over to France, but his son was stolen from his own home and never recovered. So you have some of the seedy side of things with the crimes going on, the corruption, that type of idea. And I say corruption because look at President like Harding, who had like the Teapot Dome scandal. You have the Veterans Affairs issues while he was in office. And so there's definitely some crime and then corruption also going on during the 1920s. Then you have, during the 1920s, you have the Lost Generation writers. And those are writers who are American but may have gone back to like Paris, where they felt more at ease, more welcome. But these are also American writers that stayed here, but like your F. Scott Fitzgerald, your T.S. Eliot, your Ernest Hemingway, who wanted to expose what society was really like with the facade and the lack of morals at the time period and the lack of acknowledging what life was really like. Now, not quite like the muckrakers, but certainly like showing the two-faced society of the ultra-rich versus, the everyday common person, if you will. Then you also have in the 1920s the Red Scare. And that is going to be your fear of communism coming out. And this is where you will start to see with the Red Scare, you have A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover, and you see like people that are members of unions getting arrested, especially the leadership of it, because, unions were the collective organization of people, which was like the heart of communism, right? You also have the attitude of the 1920s of laissez-faire economics, politics, everything like that, especially amongst the 1920s presidents. And this idea of laissez-faire was to, hands off on the regulation. Let businesses do their thing. Let them run the economy. Not have much governmental control, or fingers in all the different pots going on here in America, okay? So then we have two last topics, okay? The crash and then World War II, excuse me. Your economic crash of the 1920s. So keep in mind the crash happens in 1929, and some of the different reasons why would be your increase in credit spending, and I'll explain more of these here. Your stock market, and then farm price issues. Okay, so to start with, this all happens in October of 1929, and it was a long time coming, right? People had, because of the 1920s, like their mass consumers and consumption, this new idea of buying on credit. You could maybe put a little bit down and then pay it off incrementally, okay? And so people would extend credit or buy, through loans, that type of thing. Well, the problem is when too many people purchase items on credit, the business owners don't have money in their pocket then, but their product is all gone, right? Then you have the stock market. People would buy on margin, which basically meant that they would be buying stocks and banking on the fact that they could make the money off of the stock to repay their initial purchase. And then you have the farmers. The farmers had been told during World War I and given favorable loans. Expand your cropland, expand, buy the new tools and equipment and machinery, get a loan. And, they had great prices during World War I, so why wouldn't they? Well, after World War I, we didn't need to be feeding the entire world anymore. And so farmers had an excessive amount of crops, their prices dropped. You then come in with the drought going on, particularly in the Midwest, what becomes known as the Dust Bowl, okay? And it just, all of these factors combine into this massive crash. So when we have the crash, it is going to be Hoover in office. And keep in mind, Hoover had been made fun of. Hard times are hoovering over us, Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets, Hoover flags, everything like that. But the reason why is because Hoover had still maintained the idea that the government shouldn't be directly helping the people, that it should be the people lifting themselves up by the bootstraps. It should be independent organizations, that type of thing. And of course, he realized the problem too little, too late, and started to help out, but he was giving more of the breaks and the help to corporations, hoping that it would trickle down to the people, which it never did. Now, Hoover does get a bad reputation for it, but basically anything that Hoover or any president during this time period would have gotten the bad reputation, okay? But he didn't involve the government, okay, in any sort of real intervention for the people until it was too little, too late. So then we come in with FDR, okay? FDR wins this landslide victory in 1932, and he immediately starts what is going to be called his New Deal program. Now, the New Deal program, FDR will immediately start off with shutting down all banks to prevent further bank failures and bank runs. And with the shutting down of the bank, and then using like fireside chats, he reaches out to the American people to explain, hey, this is what I'm doing and why I'm doing it for you. Part of the New Deal program is going to be the 3 R's: your relief, your recovery, and your reform. So everything that FDR creates is to focus on these areas. And basically going from relief to recovery to reform is talking about your level of assistance and changing the pattern, okay? The relief was the immediate, okay? Getting people jobs, getting people aid, opening up soup kitchens, that type of idea. The recovery... So with FDR, all these different programs, the recovery, trying to do that intermediate help more for the industries, and then the reform would be to make long-lasting changes, okay? Now, his government agencies, keep in mind, FDR didn't care if you were Republican or Democrat, if you were Jewish or African American, male or female. What mattered was, are you good at your job? Are you creative? Are you going to follow through on things? Historians have said that, the entire lot was very moral, that there were no corruptions during this time period, as we had seen, under President Grant or even under President Harding, and then spilling into a bit of Coolidge as well. But the New Deal program and the government agencies, their priorities were to put Americans to work, to restructure our programs for relief, but also to get familiar with the new norm that the government is going to be involved in your daily lives or your oversight function compared to the laissez-faire 1920s. Now, to be aware of some of the programs that you should know about, okay? I'm going to rattle these off: the TVA, the AAA, the NIRA, the WPA, the CCC, the SSA, the FDIC, the SEC, all of these. These are known as our alphabet soup, right? So all of these are different programs to either cover relief, recovery, or reform. The TVA was the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it helped out the Tennessee Valley region that had always kind of been underdeveloped, getting hydroelectric power, helping with soil erosion, flood control, that type of idea. The AAA, you had a reincarnation of it, first in 1933 and then again in 1938 because it had been declared unconstitutional. But the purpose of this was to help out farmers. The NIRA was part of the NLRA, and it had been declared unconstitutional as well, but the whole point behind it was to help the industrial workers have protection and be allowed with labor unions. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, are just two examples of trying to get different people, different age groups, into working jobs. So the CCC was for men age 18 to 25, and they did a lot of conservation projects, parks, that type of thing. WPA, as well as the PWA, focused on either construction building or even then the artists, the musicians, the writers that may not have been able to, their profession wasn't construction, if you will. The SSA, the FDIC, and SEC are all around today. Social Security Administration, still around today, providing help for disabled people or old age retirement. The FDIC ensures that our banks, if you deposit your money in there, that your money will be sound and that it can't just disappear. And then the SEC is going to be the Securities Exchange Commission, which purposely regulates the stock market. So FDR did not meet always with, high-handedness, or didn't always get away with everything. There were a couple Supreme Court cases that I had mentioned, against the AAA was Schechter Poultry versus the United States. But he also had a big misstep with his court packing plan. Now, the court packing plan was 1936, 1937, and it is when he tried to argue that the Supreme Court judges, the 9 of them, were too old to handle the caseload and that they were getting behind. And so what ended up happening was he proposed that for each person over the age of 70.5 years, that you should add a new justice, which would be adding for a total of 15. Okay, so 6 more judges. And a lot of this is because FDR was pissed that they kept, he had taken 2 big losses recently on the legitimacy, of his court or of his New Deal programs, right? But eventually, you did have some retirements. The court packing plan did fail. Congress did not approve it. Even his supporters were against it, looking at him like overstepping his powers, okay? The whole point, though, Hoover versus FDR. Hoover realized too late, okay, that the government needed to be involved. And FDR knew that the government needed to be involved, but keep in mind, some of his ideas were convoluted and overstepping and too much power driven. But what it really provided was it from 1933 until 1937-38, when we hit a bit of a recession, it got people working, it gave people hope, it gave them a purpose, and it made lasting impacts not only on people's lives then, but for our lives today. Now, I say that we hit a bit of a recession in 37, 38, and the question of what got us out of that recession, was it some of the New Deal programs, or was it really going to World War II, is up for debate, okay? But overall, you could probably argue that out of the 1929 crash, with FDR becoming president, you then have your positive changes that are everlasting for our nation. So then, last bit here is going to be World War II. And with World War II, keep in mind America is going to be ending or emerging as, just like in World War I, but as a U.S. global power, okay? So looking at this, let's start off with World War II. We have U.S. neutrality. And then we also have various acts that go with it. But then also we have the appeasement in Europe. So World War II starts to gear up in Europe probably around 1936 or so, and even before then. In the 1920s, we see Benito Mussolini gain power in Italy, and he was a fascist. And then you see in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler gain control of Germany, and he is a Nazi. Same philosophical ideas, okay? Of racial superiority over others, and also anti-communist especially, okay? And then you see Francisco Franco take power in Spain with the Spanish Civil War, and he also is a fascist. So World War II is going to be between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and then you will have it against Great Britain, France, Russia, and then the United States. Now, U.S. neutrality in the 1930s, we had a series of acts that tried to keep us neutral because FDR kind of had tested the waters and realized that Americans weren't ready to go into World War II, that they still remembered World War I and the horrors from that, and we were battling with our own economic depression, so we had to be like America first, right? But he managed to find ways to send weapons or money in exchange for things like military bases or islands around the Caribbean and the Pacific for our betterment, okay? In Europe at the time, the European leaders, like from Great Britain and France, were meeting with Adolf Hitler trying to appease him. Take the Rhineland, take the Sudetenland, and, promise not to take any more land. And of course, Hitler ended up breaking that. Hitler also signed an agreement with Joseph Stalin of Russia, the Nazi-Soviet pact, saying that the Nazis would not attack the Russians if the Russians don't attack them. They agreed, which allowed Hitler then to focus on Western Europe, okay? So what ultimately ends up bringing America into the war is going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is the date which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. And this is in Hawaii. So on the morning of December 7th, it was, I'm going to rewrite that. So on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which was where we had our Navy based. Now, it was Sunday morning. It caught us off guard, as I mentioned, and it was a 2-hour attack. The outcome of it is obvious. December 8th, FDR goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. But just keep in mind, we say that we didn't know it was going to hit us at Pearl Harbor. We had intelligence information saying that an attack would more than likely happen, but we thought maybe the Philippines or Midway Island, certainly not as close to America, like mainland U.S., as Hawaii. Now, part of this was also why we knew it was going to happen was because of relations with Japan that had broken down. Because we had put economic sanctions and basically cut off Japan from their supply of oil, iron, steel, that type of thing. So as America enters the war, December 8th, 1941, we decide to focus, we have different fighting and battles and things like that. And we decide to look at Europe first, and then Japan and the Pacific, okay? Now, the reason why we focus on Europe first was the idea that if we could not defeat Hitler, and if Hitler managed to take over all of Europe, all would have been lost, even if we could have defeated the Japanese, okay? And so we go into North Africa to get a foothold into the Mediterranean and to protect our Middle East oil. And then we go into what's called like the underbelly of Europe, coming in from the south, going into like Italy and up north from there. Once we get a foothold into Europe between Italy and then with the D-Day invasion into France, we then can really start to push back the Germans and the Italians. And then, of course, by this point, the Soviets are involved in the war, and they can come from their direction as well. In the Pacific, we are fighting against Japan, which has very strong holds on their islands, on French Indochina, the Philippines, places like that. And so we start what's known as the campaign of like island hopping. We take over some of the smaller, weaker islands in the hope of circling some of those stronger Japanese islands and cutting them off by water and by air. And so do go back and refresh yourself on some of the battles in both locations, like the D-Day invasion, which is the storming in Normandy. You could look at the Battle of Berlin, the Battle of the Bulge, that type of thing. But then also, and in North Africa, like El Alamein. But then look in the Pacific, looking at Coral Sea, protecting Australia, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of going on in Philippines, but then Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And then ultimately, let's talk about the atomic bomb. So for the atomic bomb, these are, or bombs I should say, are going to be dropped in August of 1945. And it is going to be 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these bombs, when we dropped them, President Roosevelt had died by this point, and it was left up to President Truman. And President Truman had seen the test run of them in July of 45, and he's the one that issued the orders to use them. The reason why is because by this point, the kamikaze or the suicide style of fighting by the Japanese had ramped up, and Japan hadn't offered a surrender yet. And when we say surrender, we wanted an unconditional surrender, okay? Now, in April of 45, FDR died, Hitler committed suicide, and Mussolini was executed as well. In May, the war in Europe officially ended, but the war in the Pacific was still going on. And it didn't look like it would end anytime soon, hence why we dropped the atomic bombs. Now, there is debate about if we understood the magnitude of the devastation, not only the initial death toll, but then because of the radiation thereafter. There is question if we needed to drop 2, if we could have just dropped 1. And so there are varying opinions out there about the atomic bombs. But then in September 2nd, we have Victory Japan Day, when Japan finally surrendered. So other parts of World War II realized that there were a series of conferences that the Big Three, as they were called, Great Britain, Winston Churchill, Soviet Union, Stalin, and then American FDR would meet together. And some of these were at Yalta. One of the conferences was at Yalta, where they talked about the unconditional surrender of the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese. And then you also have the Potsdam Conference. And this was, talking about Germany, their surrender, and then bringing into Japan, Soviet Union coming into Japan war as well. The last part of World War II is going to be looking at the home front, okay? So for the home front, do not forget about your civil liberties that were taken away, okay? And the biggest one is going to be the Executive Order 9066. So the Executive Order 9066 was given by Roosevelt, and it was to move anyone of Japanese ancestry, particularly on the West Coast, to internment camps. Okay, now they weren't concentration camps, but they were certainly not fair or pleasant at all, for lack of a better word. But it basically forced people to move from their homes, even if they owned them, okay, from their apartments, from their businesses. They had to close up shop, but then move to these internment areas where the military would watch over them. They could leave potentially for jobs. They could have jobs in the internment camp. They could also join then the military, okay, like the 442nd Regimental Combat Group. That was, their motto was go for broke. You also have on the home front issues for women, blacks, and like Mexicans as well. And, the different job opportunities for women, you become known as a Rosie the Riveter, entering into the workforce. For the blacks, you could work in an industrial area, you could join the military, look at the Tuskegee Airmen. For the Mexicans, we're particularly looking at the Bracero program, but then also as part of their civil liberties, look at the Zoot Suit riots. Okay, that emerged particularly in Los Angeles area. So, America emerges from World War II as a global power under the leadership of Harry Truman, who was vice president when FDR died. And it is then in the next decade and years to come that Truman helps build the United States, our foreign policy involved in the United Nations, which is still around today, and then how America kind of goes isolationist in a way, and certainly America first throughout the 50s with the Korean War and our cultural changes as well into the 60s and 70s. So lots and lots happened, obviously, during period 7. It is just massive, and I feel like I just touched a little bit on everything, and I know not everything is included in it. But don't forget to go back and review. So the presidents for this era are going to be Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and then Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you have any questions, let me know, but otherwise this concludes period 7.